Australia's economy is flatlining, and no amount of spin from Jim Chalmers is going to turn that around. And indeed, the only reason Australia's economy is not doing even worse is because the government is effectively trying to cook the books. It is spending more and more money to try to offset anemic consumer and household spending. So let's have a look at the latest GDP data, and it isn't pretty. But if you've got any thoughts about it, well, you can let me know that in the comments below. So let's start off with headline GDP, which is a measure of how much output the economy is putting out. Now, headline GDP was in positive territory, but it was only weakly positive. It came in at 0.3% quarter on quarter. Now, if you annualize that, that amounts to 1.2% over the course of a 12-month period. However, if we look at this over the past 12 months, things are actually a little bit worse. Over the past 12 months, the economy has only grown 0.8%. That is not a good result, because typically you want GDP growth to be around the 2 to 3% area, obviously subject to trying to get inflation under control. In essence, the economy is underperforming. But it gets worse, and the more we dig into the data, the worse it gets. So the next thing I want to talk about is GDP per capita. That once again is in negative territory and has been for the past 7 quarters. In essence, the amount of output per person is going down. Or another way of phrasing that is we're still in a per capita recession and have been for quite some time. This is telling us on a per person basis, the economy is shrinking. Or phrased differently, one of the reasons the economy might be growing is an increase in the number of people, or more pointedly, as we're going to see in a second, government spending trying to prop up a faltering economy. In any case, GDP per person is going down. The next thing I want to look at is productivity. Now, productivity is generally something you want in an economy. You want the amount of output per hour worked to increase. That's good because it is disinflationary, i.e., if you can produce more things per hour, then you don't need to work as many hours, or you don't need to increase the number of hours worked, and therefore you don't need to increase your costs by as much. Being more productive is inherently good for GDP growth and for inflation. However, productivity is also facing issues. GDP per hour worked fell again for the second consecutive quarter. This time it fell 0.5%. In the prior quarter, it fell 0.9%. In essence, we're in a bit of a productivity recession. Over the course of the past 12 months, it fell 0.8%. What we can see here is we're in a per capita recession and what I'd call a productivity recession, and labor costs are going up. Overall, it isn't a good sign when we scratch just a little bit beneath the surface of the headline GDP growth. But wait, it gets worse, because if you actually look at what drove that anemic GDP growth such as it is, it's really just coming from government spending. Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese are basically just trying to cook the books. They're basically saying, if we go on and spend more and more money, we can make it look like we're offsetting people actually getting poorer. Now, when you look into the data, it's pretty clear what is happening, even though Jim Chalmers does try to spin this as not being the case. But if you actually look at what's happening in the data, it pretty is obvious that the government is just trying to prop up a faltering economy. And the underlying problem with this is that when the government is going out and spending money to prop up GDP growth, well, guess what happens? Inflation. Because inflation occurs when the government is going out and spending more money. When you're spending more money, per se, you get inflation. But not only that, when the government is spending money, it is inherently unproductive because the government bureaucrats spending the money don't have skin in the game. It's not their money. By contrast, if you're spending your own money, you think, do I actually value the thing that I am buying or not? Do I have a better use for the money? Is there something else I could do with it to perhaps make my life better rather than spending it on something frivolous you don't really need? By contrast, with the government, they can just spend whatever because they have no skin in the game and they don't lose from overspending. So focusing into where the GDP growth is coming from, it's really coming from government spending. The Australian Bureau of Statistics states the public sector supported domestic demand through government expenditure, which added 0.3 percentage points, and public investment another 0.3 percentage points. Remember that that's adding 0.6 percentage points to GDP growth. Now, recall the GDP only grew 0.3% in the quarter. you can immediately see that something else was detracting from GDP growth as a result. Government spending contributed 0.6 percentage points, but GDP only grew 0.3. Now, part of the reason for this appears to be that household consumption and business spending was pretty much flat. It increased 0%. Now, that isn't technically a reduction, but 0% growth is not exactly good. Now, terms of trade, that is imports versus exports, well, that also contributed another 0.1 percentage points to GDP, so already we're up 0.7, so how does it get back down to 0.3 growth? Well, it really gets back down due to changes in inventories. That is, existing inventories had effectively been sold down and reduced, and that might be a sign of things to come. It could be a sign that companies realize that the economy isn't doing super well, so they're trying to run out some of the inventories. So that's possibly an explanation here. For example, the ABS says retail trade inventories were run down, as subdued household demand saw previously imported stocks not replenished, particularly in clothing, household items, and motor vehicles. So the change in inventories might be a sign of what business thinks is happening in the economy. So when you add all of this together, what does it mean? It means we've got anemic GDP growth that is really just propped up by the government. Household consumption flatlined, business is expected to continue flatlining, GDP per person went backwards for the 7th consecutive quarter, and productivity went down. All of this is bad news. And then the fact that GDP increased, well, that was really just due to government spending, which is inflationary and is actually making things worse because they are cooking the books to prop up GDP, but then also having the side effect of raising inflation, which keeps the RBA rates higher for longer, which further exacerbates the problems in household and business spending, because when rates are higher for longer, well, part of the purpose of that is to get spending down, to stop inflation. What the RBA is really doing here is trying to offset all of the government's attempts to make the economy look good as a headline figure, but in reality, it's ultimately breaking things, because the government spending is forcing the RBA to keep rates for higher, which is then, in turn, forcing household spending and business spending to flatline. It's pretty obvious that they're just trying to cook the books in anticipation of an election to make things look good on paper as a headline figure, but when you dig beneath the figures, everything is much, much worse than they're making it out to be. And no amount of spin from Jim Chalmers is going to change that fact. Now, I expect this type of situation to continue at least into the early next year, because somewhere around maybe the second quarter of next year, we're likely to see a federal election. We're not entirely sure exactly when the election might be, sometime between March and May it appears, so we're likely to see the government continue to try this until the election, because they need to make the economy look like it is at least passable for them to have any chance of getting re-elected and get a majority government. Now, to be clear, I don't think Peter Dutton will necessarily be able to capitalize on the anemic state of the economy. Jim Chalmers is going around saying that the economy is still growing. He's going around saying that inflation is going back down toward target, even though he's just spinning. Because the inflation going back down toward target, the only reason for that is one-off temporary subsidies that ultimately are going to reverse after the federal election. It's pretty much a schmozzle in terms of inflation, similar with GDP growth, but they need to create this confected narrative in the lead up to the election, which ultimately is not good for the Australian public. But Peter Dutton has been unable to prosecute the case against this, which means that Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese can just get away with it. Furthermore, Peter Dutton, for all of his benefits and faults, is not exactly the most charismatic leader, and doesn't exactly get a ton of personal support. So it's going to be a little bit difficult for him to really be able to carry the election. Not necessarily impossible, but difficult. But of course, it remains to be seen. Maybe people will get incredibly disgruntled with the state of the economy, maybe they won't. But all I can say is the economy is not doing well, and the government is not making the situation better. They are papering over the situation to create the veneer of economic growth, when there really is underlying stagnance. But let me know what you think in the comments below.